This is 1968, Robert F. Kennedy. Of the many lingering questions in the wake of 1968, few burn quite like the ones surrounding the tragic loss of Robert Francis Kennedy. The what-ifs are innumerable, and if that's an indication of anything, it's of how much promise Bobby possessed. And while no one will ever know what it could have amounted to beyond 1968, Bobby's hopes and ideals and vision for America in the years prior, shaped by a life spent learning, set an example that many would follow, and many continue to follow to this day. So join us throughout this hour as we present the life and times of Bobby Kennedy. Standing before a sea of delegates at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, Bobby Kennedy was cheered for an uninterrupted 22 minutes. It was a poignant moment, a touching gesture that not only acknowledged Bobby's loss, but also the whole country's loss in the death of President John F. Kennedy.
I know that it was a source of the greatest strength to him to know that there were thousands of people all over the United States who were together with him, dedicated to certain principles and to certain ideals.
But while the crowd of delegates could share in Bobby's grief, they couldn't have felt the new weight bearing down on his shoulders. Because in that moment, he must have sensed that the torch had been passed, that he was now the Kennedy standard bearer. And though he knew it wasn't supposed to be that way, it was something he'd prepared for all his life.
The poet William Wordsworth said that the child is father to the man, meaning the most influential person in us as we grow up is who we were when we were about 5 years old. And I think that in the case of Bobby Kennedy, way down in line, he was at the little kid's table.
He was what his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, called the runt of the litter.
Daddy was among the younger kids, so I think Grandpa paid a lot of attention to the older ones.
He sort of got lost between the older siblings, who were Jack and Joe Jr. and Kathleen.
They were called the Golden Trio.
He actually wrote a letter to Grandpa saying, I really wish that you would talk to me about the issues that you talked to my older brothers about.
Bobby's battle for attention, particularly from his father and older siblings, would be a struggle throughout his childhood. But it was one that instilled in him something that would set him apart from the rest of the Kennedy clan.
I think he really understood the plight of the underdog.
It's often people who are not powerful are the ones who get a sense of what's going on, the sense of justice and fairness. And I think it fueled his interest in fairness and justice on one hand, and also compassion on the other.
But compassionate Bobby would be no less determined to win over his father.
He was willing to go all the way in becoming the kind of son his father admired. He wanted to look tough to his father because his father wanted toughness in his sons. And I think that really influenced who Bobby was from his early adulthood all the way through the early 60s.
If there was one thing Bobby's father valued more than toughness, it was loyalty.
Personal loyalty comes first.
And with brother Jack, in the wake of Joe Jr.'s death in World War II, tasked with carrying the Kennedy name to the heights of political power, it fell to Bobby to help him get there.
Sir, have you begun actively campaigning?
Yes, I've been working for a long time, nearly 18 months, moving around Massachusetts. I'm a congressman, and it's a big jump from Congress to the Senate.
By 1952, Bobby was a strong personality, a leader in many ways.
Precisely what Jack would need in order to defeat the Republican incumbent, Henry Cabot Lodge.
He wasn't afraid to ask questions, and he wasn't afraid to say, no, you're not doing a good job. He understood that his role was to make the campaign work. Jack could be beloved by everybody. But when you're running a campaign and you're going to do it well, you're not going to make everybody happy.
Bobby didn't care if he was liked. He just wanted Jack to win.
Jack went on to defeat Lodge, winning the election by some 70,000 votes. A feat owed in no small part to the tireless efforts of his younger brother, Bobby.
Bobby, my brother Bobby, who managed the campaign, perhaps he could give us some idea, more up to date, of what the final figures were. I think that...
But despite his success managing Jack's campaign, edging him closer to the coveted White House, Bobby wanted to explore his own aspirations.
That's not really where he saw himself. He loved to be a prosecutor. He loved to be an investigator.
He wanted to spend a career in the Justice Department.
And 1 month after the 1952 election, Bobby, enlisting the help of his father's connections, took a step in that direction.
So Bobby started out this guy who became the ultimate liberal icon, working for the ultimate Cold Warrior conservative, Joseph R. McCarthy.
Next, Bobby joins a fight against communism, aligning himself with a steward of McCarthyism. When we come back, Bobby's foray into Senate investigations.
This is the Kremlin, citadel of Russian communism.
I think Bobby saw the world as black and white, and communism was black and evil.
He saw what communism had done in Eastern Europe and in Russia. In fact, my father traveled to Russia for a couple of months, so he saw firsthand the challenges and the problems with communism.
And in the early 1950s, to Bobby, who was eager to make his own way as a prosecutor and as an investigator, there was no better way to do so than to combat communism.
We've got to dig and root out the communists and the crooks and those who are bad for America.
In December 1952, Bobby went to work for Republican Senator Joseph R. McCarthy as assistant counsel.
He was very fond of McCarthy. But as the Irish Catholic Bond very much see themselves as the bulwark against communism in the world. And Bobby personified that, and he wanted to go work for McCarthy.
But the enthusiasm would wear off quickly for Bobby.
He did not like Joe McCarthy's tactics at all.
Apparently every time anybody says anything against anybody working for Senator McCarthy, he is swearing them and is he accusing them of communism.
Just answer the question, do you know?
Bobby became conflicted with McCarthy fairly early on.
After a few months, he broke with McCarthy. But while disillusioned with McCarthy, he remained no less committed to the work of investigation.
And you've got people in Detroit, at least 15 who have police records. You've got Joey Glimko in Chicago. I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
In 1957, Bobby was appointed chief counsel to the Senate's McClellan Committee. And it was there where he'd place his grit as a prosecutor on full display, earning a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life.
The word ruthless came out of his prosecution of Jimmy Hoffa.
You've had the worst case of amnesia in the last 2 days I've ever heard of.
Jimmy Hoffa, to him, was the embodiment in everything bad about the union movement. He saw Jimmy Hoffa as a corrupt leader, one who was selling out his membership.
I wonder how you would evaluate the success of you and the McClellan Committee thus far in your investigation of the activities of Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters.
Well, I think the only important thing really is whether we get legislation to deal with the problems. I think we've uncovered the fact that there are many difficulties, that there has been misuse of union funds, misappropriation of union funds.
He was determined that a labor movement would not be tarred by the mob.
But as determined as he was, he'd have to put his crusade against Hoffa on hold.
On take one, 2815, Senator Kennedy, Curtis Publishing.
Because in 1960, he'd be needed to finish the job he and his family started a decade and a half earlier.
Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts, Democrat, throws his hat in the presidential ring at a Washington press conference.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
Bobby Kennedy was determined to do whatever it took to see his brother Jack be president.
And if Bobby's reputation for being ruthless wasn't already cemented, it was about to be.
He would fire up the squad, he would yell at people, he'd make sure that they were doing their job, even at the cost of relationships.
Bobby Kennedy learned to be ruthless from the master of ruthlessness, who was his father, Joe Kennedy. He orchestrated everything, and Bobby understood how to do it quietly in a way that the only people who really appreciated what he was doing were his father and his big brother Jack, and they understood that he was as critical to electing John F. Kennedy president in 1960 as John F. Kennedy was.
Give me your help and your hand and your voice.
Probably more than anyone, Jack was talking to Southern Democrats on that July night in 1960. Constituents both he and Bobby knew they'd need if they had any hope of defeating their Republican opponent, who just happened to be an incumbent vice president from a popular administration. So when it came time to pick a running mate for Jack, there was only one option. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the imposing senator from Texas, Kennedy's best chance to secure votes from Southern Democrats. But for Bobby, having Johnson on the ticket, no matter how much sense it made, was nearly inconceivable.
It was rich from the beginning. They didn't like each other. Bobby, I think, mostly didn't like Johnson.
It was a dislike that dated back years, stemming from a number of encounters between the two.
And when it came time for Jack to pick Johnson as his running mate out of electoral necessity, Bobby did everything he could to break it apart and to kill the deal.
But Bobby's efforts were all in vain. In the end, he would be overruled.
Today, Lyndon Johnson is proud to be standing behind and beside the next Democratic president of this country and will help him inaugurate his program of the new frontiers.
Bobby didn't like it, but with the decision final, there was little time to brood. Bobby had 3.5 months to get the job done, and for those 3.5 months, he ate, slept, and breathed the campaign. On election night, with a race neck and neck, Bobby kept working the phones, and when everyone went to bed, it was Bobby, sleeves still rolled up, who stayed up to watch the returns come in, never surrendering to rest until the fight had been won.
As morning comes and a narrow margin in Minnesota clinches the Kennedy victory, newspapers headline the election of a new president. The voting between the two candidates is the closest since Grover Cleveland defeated James Blaine in 1884.
The Kennedys had the White House, and firmly in their grasp. It would become, in many ways, just as much Jack's as it was Bobby's.
Bobby Kennedy was, in the Kennedy administration, the closest thing to a co-president that America had ever seen to that point, and that it will probably ever see again.
After securing his brother's election as President of the United States, Bobby's work doesn't go unrewarded. Next, Bobby makes waves as a member of the Kennedy administration.
So with Bobby Kennedy, there were always two versions of the story. The sort of spun version that he put out there was that he was the reluctant candidate, that it was his father who wanted him to be Attorney General. The truth is that that was the one job that made sense for Bobby, that he wanted it almost as much as his father wanted him to have it, because he was arguably the least qualified on paper Attorney General ever named by a president.
When he was named, there was a lot of criticism that this was nepotism. Anthony Williams, who was a New York Times writer, was outraged that the president would choose his own brother as the Attorney General.
Against all the criticism, Jack would quip, "I can't see that it's wrong to give him a little legal experience before he goes out to practice law." But Bobby would prove fairly quickly that he was no legal greenhorn.
The rackets have become too widespread, too well organized, and too rich. It is my firm belief that new laws are needed to give the Federal Bureau of Investigation increased jurisdiction to assist local authorities.
He was the person who said there's such a thing as organized crime and got a federal law passed so that you could prosecute organized crime.
Before Bobby took over as Attorney General, the Justice Department had 17 lawyers assigned to the Organized Crime Unit. Bobby would add another 43, but of course the mafia wouldn't be his only target.
Bobby Kennedy is setting aside every constitutional right of every American in this country.
Picking up where he left off, Bobby resumed his war against Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa.
It was his role in life to bring down this man he believed to be totally corrupt.
In the end, they became one another's enemy to the point where you knew one of them was going to bring the other one down, and it was Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, who brought Jimmy Hoffa down.
He would eventually get him on jury tampering, finally winning a conviction in 1964.
He understood the forces in this country that were trying to undercut our system of justice.
And in the early 1960s, there was no greater force undercutting America's system of justice than racial discrimination.
The thing that is hurting us most is the continued existence of segregation and discrimination.
But Bobby's understanding of that injustice would take some refining.
In the early days when Bobby started out, Martin Luther King said there is deep within Bobby some real good, and it's up to us to pull that good out of him.
He didn't understand the viciousness of some whites in the South.
We have proven that even though the law of the land says that a passenger can ride interstate and participate in lunchroom, waiting rooms, and bathrooms, that even though the law says this, everyone cannot, particularly the Negro.
He made an enormous mistake when the Freedom Riders, when their bus was burned in a place called Anniston, Alabama. Bobby Kennedy went in with too little force and too late.
So Bobby learned.
Hello? Yes, sir. General, how are you? Fine, Governor. How are you?
He realized the mistake he made in Montgomery, and he wasn't about to make that mistake, and he didn't, in the tensest face-off in the whole civil rights movement.
The eyes of the nation and the world shifted to Oxford and Jackson, Mississippi, where James Meredith sought to become the first of his race to enroll in the University of Mississippi.
With angry white mobs, among them the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, threatening to block Meredith's admission to the University of Mississippi, Bobby took swift and decisive action.
They had to bring in troops from Memphis, federal troops, in order to protect those marshals and protect Meredith. In fact, Bobby said at one point, if anybody puts a hand on Meredith, shoot him. He was tough.
With the full weight of the United States government behind him, James Meredith was escorted onto campus and enrolled as a first African-American student at the University of Mississippi.
I think that experience of the civil rights movement opened his eyes to the sufferings in all sorts of parts of our society and really made him want to do something about it.
And on all issues the Kennedy administration would face, whether it be civil rights or the crisis of Cuba and communism containment, Bobby could always be found closely counseling his older brother, the president.
They would complete each other's sentences. They knew how to talk to each other almost with monosyllabic words.
And all much to the chagrin of the vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
You know, Bobby just made no secret of his distaste for Johnson. He would barge in on meetings when he was meeting with the president. He would try to usurp some of the responsibilities that had been given to Johnson.
Throughout his time as vice president, Johnson would grow to resent Bobby, just as much as Bobby resented Johnson.
They just don't like the smell of each other. They don't like the look of each other, the existence of the other. It was almost that primordial.
They didn't click.
More than anyone else in the Kennedy administration, and most certainly more than Lyndon Johnson, Bobby had the president's ear. They were the two kings of Camelot. But as fate would have it, their reign would be brief, ended on a cruel November day in 1963. In an instant, all Bobby and his brother had worked so hard for was stripped away.
Your brother's killed and your whole world collapses.
A complete change in your life. It was a terrible time for Bobby.
And standing among the shattered pieces of a life ruptured by tragedy, Bobby would find himself at a crossroads. Turn and hide away, or pick up the mantle and continue what his brother started. When we come back, Bobby endures the tragic loss of his brother and a dilemma that in the end he knows can only be solved with one decision. His life suddenly and tragically upended by the death of his brother, Bobby was left shattered, unsure of how to pick up the pieces. But in time, he'd find a way, and in the process, finding a voice that would make him one of the most prominent and influential politicians of the 1960s.
I do think, at the risk of sounding like an amateur shrink, something happened with the death of his brother that threw him into an existential crisis.
My bedroom was right next to his bathroom, and he would listen to Shakespeare every morning while he was doing his sit-ups. So I think he was always searching for something deep and understanding of human nature and what happens when you're struck with tragedy.
When I think of President Kennedy, I think of what Shakespeare said in Romeo and Juliet, when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he shall make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun.
In the months following Jack's assassination, Bobby, stuck in a deep rut, considered a complete break from public life.
He'd been the second most powerful man in America and suddenly was consigned to the outer fringes because the incoming president and he just despised each other.
But as Bobby would come to realize, that was not a position he was willing to accept.
Bobby just couldn't take that. He wasn't going to live with that.
He saw that there were problems in our society, and he felt that he could make a contribution.
Over the past few weeks, many leading members of the Democratic and the Liberal parties here in the state of New York have talked to me about being a candidate for the United States Senate. I've decided to make myself available for the nomination of the Democratic State Convention.
It was a tough campaign because in the sense that he had never been on the stump himself.
He ran against Ken Keating, an incumbent senator. It was not an easy race.
But Bobby, no stranger to being the underdog, put up a fight.
And he became a very powerful and national senator from the state of New York in 1964.
Reinvigorated and now his own man, upon his new platform, the Bobby of old would reemerge.
More of the Bobby that he was born, which was a very sensitive young kid who cared about others, who was generous.
For years, he'd seen the worst of humankind, culminating with the murder of his brother.
He had, as Richard Goodwin once wrote, probably knew more about the dark side of America than any other public official, because he'd investigated organized crime on the Senate. He'd been an attorney general. He knew the power that the bad guys had in a way that I think most politicians don't.
He emerged from that with a different role. He was freer to express his concern for and his empathy with people who were on the margins of society.
He would go off on these Senate missions and he'd get down to the Mississippi Delta where he'd see people, young African-American kids living on molasses. He went out west and saw the California farm workers being treated like serfs. He went to the Indian reservations and he saw how people were treated there.
I remember when he came back from the Delta, he entered our dining room, which was a beautiful dining room, the crystal chandelier and the linen tablecloths. He said, I've just been to Mississippi, and people live in a room the size of our dining room, a whole family. He said, do you know how lucky you are? Do you know how lucky you are? Do something for our country.
If we learned anything in the last summer and over the period of the last 30 years, what we've been doing hasn't been the answer.
He had begun to challenge some of the assumptions of orthodox liberalism, that indeed there was a problem with top-down government, that it was substituting welfare checks for jobs and empowerment of poor people, particularly black and brown people. He was much more attuned to that kind of dissent that was beginning to foment in the 1960s on the part of what I would regard the smarter left. Say, you know, you pass a federal aid to education bill, but are the schools getting any better? Are kids learning? Or are you just empowering a bureaucracy?
Bobby would put that same fiery passion behind another issue as well: the Vietnam War.
What seems to be overlooked is the ability of the North Vietnamese to escalate this war step by step with Washington.
We should move toward a final settlement, which allows all the major political elements of South Vietnam to participate in their choice of leadership and shape their future direction of their country.
One of the things that made Kennedy really exceptional was that he was publicly willing to admit mistakes. When he gave his first speech breaking with Johnson on Vietnam, he said, if there's blame to be passed around, I get my fair share because I was part of the decision-making that caused the initial escalation.
It was precisely the kind of shift that Lyndon Johnson had feared the most. And at the hands of his longtime adversary, it would add yet another layer to the Johnson-Kennedy feud.
I don't say that we are without fault. I don't say that even the administration that I was involved with, President Kennedy, was without fault in our policy toward Vietnam.
He was striking a chord about what was going on in our country. That was a really tough time. There was the draft, so you had young people being drafted to fight in a war that they might not like. There had been riots in '66 and '67 in our inner cities because African Americans thought there was not justice.
This is going to happen all over America. It's going to be a hot world, not a hot summer. It's a hot world.
So there was a large sense of emotion attached to what was right and what was wrong.
I think this is a shame. This is a disgrace.
And it was very much, it came to a boiling point in 1968.
And it was in that year, amidst all that turmoil, that Bobby would step out and embark on a fervent campaign to mend a nation so wounded by division. Bobby throws his hat in the ring. When we return, Bobby seizes his political opportunity and strikes, joining the 1968 race for President of the United States.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I think that is the least that I can do.
He was reluctant to get involved in that race because he thought, originally, because he thought that if he did, it would just be seen as a vendetta against Lyndon Johnson, and it would just be a personal fight.
How about President Johnson and me? What about it? What are you trying to start a fight or something?
And Bobby's feeling on this, I think, is he's fearful of running because he thinks he's going to lose, first of all, but also thinks he'll divide the party.
Bobby had been putting it off, putting it off, putting it off.
I have listened to the young people of our nation and felt their anger about the war that they are sent to fight.
And he finally said yes at a very awkward moment.
The big surprise of the first primary of Campaign 68,
has been the strength of Senator Eugene McCarthy.
Well, what happened was Gene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, ran as the anti-war candidate starting in November of '67, and he ran an uphill campaign in the New Hampshire primary against Lyndon Johnson and scored very well. He came in very close. It was a moral victory. He upset Johnson.
The fact that we are over 40% puts all of these things together as a very significant, it seems to me, vote of protest against the administration policy and really, I suppose, in part also against the administration.
Exactly 4 days after that, Bobby Kennedy raises his hand and he says, "Me too, I want to run too."
I think the New Hampshire primary established that the division that exists in this country, the division that exists in the Democratic Party are there, that I haven't brought that about. That what has brought that about is what President Johnson, the policies that are being followed by President Johnson.
McCarthy resented the way Kennedy jumped in the race and felt that he stole his thunder.
Are you prepared to deal with Bobby Kennedy?
I'm not really prepared to deal with anybody so far as my candidacy is concerned. I committed myself to a group of young people, and I thought rather idealistic adults in American society. I said I would be their candidate, and I intend to run as I committed myself to run.
I was for McCarthy, and I at the time didn't like Bobby jumping in because I thought McCarthy was doing well. But Bobby, the more I studied it, Bobby had this belief that he could win the general election.
He wanted to end the war in Vietnam, and he wanted to help people in our own country and around the world.
He thought he was the man to do it. Johnson couldn't do it. McCarthy wouldn't do it. He wanted to do it.
Interestingly enough, when Kennedy gets in the race in mid-March, 2 weeks later, Johnson drops out.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
He saw the handwriting that Vietnam was his albatross, and so he jumps out of the race.
And when that happens, Kennedy kind of pivots from talking about the war in Vietnam to talking about racial issues, and famously gives this speech in Indianapolis the night that Martin Luther King is assassinated.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
After he learned that Martin Luther King had been killed, he had been scheduled to go into the inner city of Indianapolis, and the police chief, the mayor said, "I don't think you should go, I don't think it's safe," which they were right to say that in the sense that there were riots that broke out in about 100 other cities in the United States. But he said, my campaign is about reaching people in their own pain and in their own sorrow and in their own loss.
In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
It was a very personal, reflective speech on the part of a guy running for president who realized that this was not the time to talk about my 5-point program for anything, but to just try to point out what was happening in the country and why this was such a cancer.
I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times.
There would be no riot in Indianapolis that night. A month later, Bobby won the Indiana Democratic primary, and a week after that, Nebraska. He was picking up momentum and drawing a crowd everywhere he went.
He would come home and his hands would be swollen. He'd have to put them in ice because they were so swollen from people grabbing onto him.
I can remember for some reason, I don't know what the hell I was doing there, sitting in the back of the convertible wrapping my arms around his lower leg so he literally wouldn't be pulled out of the car. Not by people out to hurt him, but people out to embrace him.
We can bring about the changes so that the control of government is returned to the people themselves.
But in the Oregon primary, Bobby would suffer a setback.
Robert Kennedy had lost the Oregon primary a week before, California. Only primary any Kennedy had lost. California was make or break. It was winner take all. He said if he lost the primary, he was going to drop out and endorse McCarthy.
Is the load rich enough following California to bring you back to a position of strength?
Because first place, these many of these delegates are committed now. A number of them are committed now, but they're not permanently committed.
There was a real sense that this was, if he won, there was no guarantee that he was headed for the nomination. It was going to be a really, I think, an uphill battle. Had he lost, he'd be out. So those were the stakes.
But the stakes would prove to be much higher, because what would happen in California wouldn't be just another primary. It would be another American tragedy. In California, Bobby's campaign comes to a sudden stop. When we come back, the tragedy inside the Ambassador Hotel.
Senator, as a result of this presumed California victory, do you think now that there will be a further delay in the movement of the big city politicians?
On June 4th, 1968, Bobby Kennedy won the California Democratic primary. Just after midnight, on June the 5th, he appeared to thank a crowd of supporters in the Embassy Ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California.
We can start to work together. We are a great country and a selfish country and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next few months.
I was upstairs in the hotel. We were getting ready for a victory party at a place called The Factory, which was a kind of an early version of a disco.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
As Bobby turned to leave, he was directed to exit through the hotel's kitchen and pantry.
There were rows and rows of people. Well, I say maybe 3 rows of people standing, to see him.
Juan Romero was among them. He was 17 years old, working at the hotel as a busboy.
I say he was within 2 feet from me, 3 feet from me. He grabbed my hand and took a step forward, and that's when I heard the firecracker noise.
Look out for the gun! I'm doctor! I'm doctor!
Phone rang, I picked up the phone, it was one of ours. She said, I think something's happened to the senator. I thought he'd gotten sick because he'd been so exhausted. And then she said, I think he's been shot. And by that time, the TV was already covering it.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Oh, God, Sam! Oh, what?
All I could see was a circle of feet and the senator on the floor.
Amid all the commotion, Romero knelt beside Bobby and cradled his head.
I seen his lips move, so I put my ears next to his lips to see if he could tell me what, and I heard that, is everybody okay? And I said, yes, everybody's okay. Then he turned his head towards his right hand, and I heard him say, everything's gonna be okay.
We need a doctor here. Where's the doctor?
Will you please clear the room and offer your prayers at this hour?
As medics made their way to Bobby, Romero stepped away, but then remembered he had a rosary in his shirt pocket.
I remember saying to myself, well, he's going to lead it a lot more than I do. So I remember wrapping it around his thumb as much as I could, and then just walked away.
The suspect, now identified as Sirhan Sirhan, was grabbed by Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer, the 2 Kennedy men.
Bobby had been shot, and I couldn't believe it. And I couldn't believe it. We started praying for him.
Will you please clear the room?
all that day, you know, everybody prayed for him. And then the following morning, he died.
I have a short announcement to read, which I will read at this time. Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
I remember when my brother called me to tell me that Daddy had died. And I remember really just praying for him and praying for the person who killed him and saying, I hope nothing happens to him, because I don't want any other family to have to go through what we're going through right now.
My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it.
After he died, the funeral train took him from St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to Washington, D.C. And there were thousands, millions of people came out to that funeral train and watched it go by, black and white, young and old, rich and poor.
When you would look out the window and see who was lining the tracks to say goodbye, you know, there were old guys in their Army uniforms, there were kids in their Little League baseball uniforms and Cub Scout uniforms, there was people of every conceivable kind along the tracks to say goodbye.
And a journalist who was on that train said, what is it about Bobby that he can get people to do this? What were those people doing? And I think the answer to that is that he really called forth the best in his audience. He had this idyllic vision of America and what we could be as a country.
Maybe at least in this campaign, the fact that people discuss these issues and discuss these questions, we'll know what we're going to do, and we'll know where we are.
People want somebody who speaks the truth and has a warm heart, you know, so that you're open to other people's pain. It's hard to be open to pain, even in personal relationships, not even politics. We try to usually avoid pain, and he was open to it.
I think if people walk away with one thing, one lesson learned, it was what Daddy said all the time: one person can make a difference, and we all have an obligation to try. And that kind of vision in his Ripple of Hope speech, that you don't have to bend history. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope.
And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. If Athens shall appear great to you, said Pericles, consider then that her glories were purchased by valiant men and by men who learned their duty. That is the source of all greatness in all societies, and it is the key to progress in our time.
For Bobby Kennedy, 1968 was his final year. At just 42 years old, his life snuffed out by an assassin. But his spirit, his dreams of the future, his drive for change would flourish well into the next decade, and the next, and the next. In a year so clogged with unrest, Bobby Kennedy sought so diligently to be the needle that could thread the country back together. A voice of reason and understanding, a legacy that not only makes Bobby important in those times, but also in all times. That'll do it for us today. I'm Ellie Pai Hong. As we leave, one last look at the life and times of Bobby Kennedy.